Hi, everybody. My name is Andrea Kesalonis. I'm the Adult Services Librarian for Falmouth Memorial Library. Tonight I've got Earl Brechlin with us. And Earl has such a storied career in Maine that I actually have notes on it because you are the first presenter, Earl, that I couldn't remember everything off the top of my head. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Earl. So he's an award-winning writer. He's a journalist and historian. His newest book is Wild, Weird, Wonderful Maine, and it's a cross between a Down East version of Ripley's Believe It or Not, a library full of field guides, and a celebratory compendium of myths, legends, and tall tales. The book is a proud, authoritative anthology of everything cool, quirky, and bizarre about the great state of Maine. Earl is also a registered Maine guide, and he lives in Bar Harbor with his wife, Roxy. He won the John Cole Award for Maine-themed nonfiction in 2019 for Return to Moose River, which is a collection of essays that celebrate the natural and human history of the Great North Woods. If you have not read Return to Moose River, come see me at the library, call me at the library. We'll make sure that we get a copy into your hands. Earl was also the founding editor of the Mount Desert Islander, which is a weekly newspaper that has repeatedly won first place for general excellence from National, New England, and Maine press associations. He is the holder of more than 100 awards for news and feature writing and photography. He is the former Maine Journalist of the Year and has authored 9 books. He's currently working on a new book about the mysterious downing of a Navy ship off the coast of Maine in World War II. I would like to note that Wild, Weird, Wonderful Maine and other books by Earl Brechlin are available at local bookstores, at islandportpress.com, and other online retailers. Make sure you check out his website. It's earlbrechlin.com, and I'm going to pop that right in the chat box so you have that at the ready. But without further ado, please, everyone, help me welcome Earl Brechlin.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, and thank you and the library for having authors like myself out there to talk about and celebrate books and literature, and in particular the history of Maine. So what I'm going to do is give me a second here to set up the screen sharing, and we'll go through some of my favorite items from Wild, Weird, Wonderful Maine. So the main thing I'd like to do is just tell you a little bit about the book. It kind of was time to arrive with Maine's bicentennial, but thanks to COVID, we all know how that went. And anyway, what's in the book is it's 300 people, places, things, and events that really made Maine what it is today. It's like an encyclopedia. There's listings, there's photographs. I included some lists of stuff o' Maine, the 10 largest, tallest mountains, the 10 largest lakes, the 10 longest rivers. I have a list and some further text about all the world records that have been set in Maine. The lighthouses, the covered bridges, the governors, and then what I call the stuff o' Maine, which is the state dessert, the state flower, the state animal, the state tree, things of that nature. And then also, years ago, every town in Maine seemed to have a special claim to fame. They were the capital of something. Franklin was the granite capital, and Belfast was the broiler capital. Phillips, Maine was the toothpick capital. So we have a list of those as well. And the book is broken down into 5 kind of geographical areas. And the idea is that hopefully as you read through and want to learn more or go to some of these areas, you'll take the book and partner it with the Maine Atlas and Gazetteer, which most folks I know in Maine have one in the car, one in the house, one in the library, whatever, because we've included the coordinates for the pages and maps in the Maine Atlas and Gazetteer, so you can go to some of these places for yourself. The book kind of came together as I was working on other other projects and other books. And I made a master list of 600 kind of unique things about Maine, historical events or people or places, and winnowed it down to about 300 for the book. Collected about 2,500 photos, and 20 years ago it would have been almost impossible, but now between Maine Digital Commons and Wikipedia and other institutions that have so many wonderful images online, we're able to collect those. So there's about 150 images in the book. So without further ado, let's get started, and we'll start kind of down near your area with Mackworth Island, which is Maine's real pet cemetery. And Stephen King's movie of that same name always made a big splash. But Percival Baxter, who was governor between 1921 and 1925 and went on to create Baxter State Park, had his own pet cemetery with a view of the water in Casco Bay. And it's the final resting place of 14 of his beloved English setter dogs. I guess he loved English setters, go with one breed. That was fine. And then one horse named Jerry Roan, who the headstone notes was a noble horse and true friend. And here's a closer up image of some of the plaques and what have you. Now, Gary Owen, who was Gary II in the Irish Setters, was the constant companion of Baxter's when he was in the State House, when he served his term as governor in the early 1920s. And there was quite a kerfluffle both among people of his supporters and the opposition party, because when his dog passed away, he ordered the flags at the State House in Augusta to be flown at half staff while the dog's body was transported to this cemetery. And as many of you undoubtedly know, there's a wonderful walking path around the circumference, and Governor Baxter's School for the Deaf is there also. I always like to tell folks about Maine's not so great escape. A lot of folks don't know that Maine was home to several prisoner of war camps during World War II, which housed German prisoners and prisoners from the European theater. And one of the largest ones was actually in Holton. But there was also a good-sized one that housed over 300 prisoners near Spencer Lake up near Jackman in a place called Hobbstown, and the camp was named after that. They worked on harvesting ice, they worked in the woods, they did a variety of different hard work, and several of the prisoners decided they wanted to make an escape and try to get away. And unfortunately, in March in Maine, there's still plenty of winter left. So they had squirreled away some rations, and they fashioned crude snowshoes, and they made a compass out of a peach can and a magnetized needle, which one breathless newspaper account at the time said worked as well as one from L.L. Bean. The escape launched one of the largest manhunts in Maine history, with aircraft and 50 law enforcement officers. And they searched and searched and really couldn't find them until they talked to an old guide who was kind of a hermit near the Forks, and said, where are we going to find these guys? And he said, well, between the swamp and between the swollen Dead River and all these other different obstacles, he said, wait 3 or 4 days and go to this spot. And he gave them the location. And sure enough, they went there several days later, and they found the prisoners huddling in a lean-to, cold and hungry and actually eager to go back to the camp. And the image at right is a monument that the children at the Forest Hill School in Jackman erected about the camp on the site, where the only thing that remains is what's left of the camp's bread oven, which you can see in that particular image. One of my favorite stories that kind of epitomizes the Maine spirit is the last voyage of Jeanette Corbett. And the brig Lena Thurlow hove into the bay off Cutler in the summer of 1873, and watchers on shore noticed she had a pennant at half staff indicating there had been a death on board. Well, at once at the dock, Captain Tristan Thurlow Corbett, who was just 27 years old, let people know that his blushing bride, Jeanette, 26, had died of a tropical disease while the vessel was loading a cargo of rum and sugar and other items in Cuba. On her deathbed, Jeanette implored her husband to please bring her back and bury her in Maine. She didn't want to be buried in Cuba or in the tropics anyway. But in the summer of 1873, how do you get a body back to Cutler? It was going to take some weeks for the ship to make that transit, and they didn't, of course, have any refrigeration. So Captain Corbett went to the rum distillery, got a large barrel, and they put her body in the barrel and then filled it with rum and put it right down in the hold with the rest of the cargo, and off they came back to Maine. Yellow fever was rampant in Cuba at the time. The story doesn't really say what she died of, but there were lots of reports in the New York Times of ships coming from Cuba having to quarantine, which nowadays in the era of COVID, we can certainly understand. Well, the good people of Cutler were certainly reluctant to open that casket, and the undertaker said he wasn't going to because he didn't want to unleash some plague upon the citizens of Cutler. So they did what any good New Englander would do, and they dug a large circular hole, and they put the barrel and her in that and buried it all. And that's still to this day, that's her casket, and it's in the cemetery just outside the village of Cutler. Back in 1857, Congress directed the Coast and Geodesic Survey to do new maps of the United States, and they decided they needed to create a series of 10 super straight lines in different areas from Maine to Georgia from which to triangulate to create these maps. And a site on the Blueberry Barrens on the Epic Plain north of Harrington, way down east, was chosen. And the crews measured and remeasured and did it again, and finally they got an accuracy of an error rate of less than 2 inches in 5.4 miles. And this was called the Epic Baseline. And there's still a road there to this day that goes off across the Blueberry Barrens. Now, the work was overseen by Alexander Bach, who was actually the great grandson of Benjamin Franklin. And the monuments that marked both ends were subject to vandalism over the years. So one's now located in the Maine State Museum, and the other one is in the museum in Cherryfield. And it's the only one of the 10 original lines that can still be visited. Now, while all that was going on, the supervisor of the work was sent up from Washington, D.C., and he was none other than Jefferson Davis, who would later go on, of course, to become president of the Confederate States. He was a former U.S. Senator and Secretary of War, and he visited the site in 1858, and he and his wife, Varnia, stopped on Lop of Lead Mountain, which was called Humpback Mountain then, in the town of Bennington. They spent 3 weeks on the mountains because it was said that the air was great and he was a little sickly and thought it would make him feel a lot better. The trail to the summit is still known today as the Jefferson Davis Road. Legend holds that Davis left a trunk at a local inn called the Shoppy House with instructions that it only be given to someone with a password. And local folks believe perhaps it held the secret plans for the start of the Civil War, but it was found out later that it was just some surveying documents that he wanted to make sure got into the right hands. Maine has a great tie to the film The Wizard of Oz in Margaret Hamilton, who played the character of the Wicked Witch, who frightened, of course, a whole generation of little children with the threat of "I'll get you, my pretty," and the little dog, too. Well, in 1961, she purchased a small island called Cape Island, just off the village of Cape Newagon in Southport, which is right next to Booth Bay. And she spent a lot of time there, was really well liked by local residents, and she would row back and forth between the local fishermen's dock and what then became known as Witch's Island. And according to Bass Harbor writer Laurie Schreiber, she once fell into the water in autumn and luckily was rescued by a local taxi driver, and just showed you that she didn't disappear in a puff of smoke like she did in The Wizard of Oz. Hamilton passed away in 1985, but her family continues to enjoy the island today. And everyone you talked to in the Booth Bay area said she was the nicest person, no hint of that character that she played. I think one of the unsung heroes of this country and certainly of Maine is Francis Perkins, who, when Franklin Roosevelt decided to launch his New Deal and lift the country out of the Great Depression, he created the Civilian Conservation Corps, Public Works Administration, and hired Frances Perkins of Newcastle as his labor secretary. And she helped institute the minimum wage, a 40-hour work week, and the creation of Social Security. She made those things possible. She was the first female cabinet officer in United States history. She made the president promise he would pursue those goals if she took the job, and her only regret that they never finished universal health care, which of course we're still arguing over today. After government service, she went on to teach at Cornell and spent many summers at her family home and on the Damariscotta River in Newcastle. And in 2008, the Frances Perkins Center was founded there, where you can go and learn more about her life and her connection to Franklin Roosevelt and all the good things that Maine did for the country. Maine has had some of its own close encounters of the strange kind involving flying saucers and unidentified flying objects. In 1976, several men, all students from Massachusetts, reported seeing strange lights and flying saucers or UFOs on the shores of Eagle Lake in the Allagash Wilderness Waterway. They reported 4-fingered gray aliens with almond-shaped eyes, conducted tests on them and kidnapped them for a short time. They reported this to the ranger, but it really only surfaced in their memories during hypnosis sessions years later. In 2016, the St. John Valley Times, a small paper up in the valley up there, reported that one of the men recanted, saying that they'd been using some recreational drugs at the time. However, most of the men swore they had only consumed 1 beer each. And the Allagash abductions, there's a book about it, and you can read more about Maine's close encounters of the close kind. I think one of the most remarkable dynasties in Maine has to be the Stanley Brothers from Kingfield. They were twin brothers, Francis Edgar and Freeland Oscar. And they were born in Kingfield in 1849 and graduates of what was then the equivalent of the University of Maine at Farmington. And they went into teaching, but they really had inventive natures. So they're perhaps best known for their Stanley steamer, their steam car, which was famous and was one of the first record-holding early car. They also invented the artist's airbrush and created dry plate photography. Let's go to the next slide here. In 1906, the Stanley steamer had the world record going 127 miles an hour on a Florida beach. They later, in the center lower image, created the Stanley Hotel in Estes Park, Colorado, where they built a mountain wagon, a 30 horsepower bus powered by steam that delivered guests to the facility. Interestingly enough, that hotel is another tie back to Maine because it was the hotel that inspired Stephen King to write his novel, The Shining, which was actually set in that particular building. And then also their sister, Chansonette Amons, who was just an incredible photographer. She was an artistic genius. She was the only girl born into a family of 6 boys. She was a teacher and an accomplished photographer, and was known for her images traveling throughout New England, taking pictures of workaday people, farmers in the field, blacksmiths in their smithies. And so I really think that the Stanley Brothers were great. And the other thing they invented, which was dry plate photography, which was purchased by them for then an astronomical sum of millions of dollars by a gentleman named George Eastman, who went on to found the Kodak company with their invention. So between steam cars, artist airbrush, which we still use today, dry plate photography, and the Kodak company, the Stanley Brothers had their hands in all of that. I think one of the saddest stories in Maine is what happened to several villages when the Long Falls Dam, the gates were closed and created Flagstaff Lake up near the Bigelow Mountain Range in northwestern Maine. It created the 4th largest lake in Maine, but as the water rose in 1950, it inundated 3 communities, including the village of Flagstaff, Dead River, and Bigelow. Many houses were moved, but others were merely abandoned. And it was also that the Central Maine Power could generate water, power downstream and also help control flooding. One of the more unusual things about it is that more than 300 bodies had to be exhumed from 2 local cemeteries and then were relocated and then all laid out in perfect rows in the village of Eustis now, which is on the shores of the lake. I think one of the great tragedies of the entire process was the village of Flagstaff, where there was a flagpole there reportedly erected by Benedict Arnold on his ill-fated expedition to Quebec in 1775, and which of course is profiled in Kenneth Roberts' wonderful book Arundel. And you know, that's a historical site that now is covered by over 50 feet of water. For some of you that maybe longer in the tooth may remember that Sunday afternoon TV had a lot of interesting shows back in the 50s and 60s. And among them, before Bassmaster Bill Nance was there, or televangelist, there was Roscoe Vernon Gadabout Gaddis, who eventually settled in Bingham, Maine. But he would tool around North America in his Piper Cherokee plane, wearing a cowboy hat, and he just loved to go fishing. So he did shows including Outdoors with Liberty Mutual, Going Places with Gadabout Gaddis, and ultimately The Flying Fisherman. He did it all with a single cameraman who just filmed from a second boat or canoe. And they didn't record narration. They didn't do second takes. There was none of the setting up things like they do in reality TV. As a matter of fact, if he didn't catch a fish in 5 days, that's what the show actually was about. He went on to expand his empire to sell fishing gear, books, and posters, and eventually purchased the Bingham Airport, which was renamed Gadabout Gaddis Field. It's now home to North Maine Rivers Rafting. And the Maine Aeronautics Association named its biggest award after him, called the Gadabout Gaddis Cup. He went to that great trout stream in the sky in 1986 at the ripe old age of 90. You know, Texas always has the bragging rights of having the biggest and the best of everything, but Maine had Katahdin and Granger, which in the early years of the 1900s were billed as the largest oxen on the face of the planet. And one was named Katahdin, the other Granger, by a farmer named Alfonso Rand in Stetson. And they were used to help pull stumps and move rocks and haul logs, but they continued to grow and grow until Granger weighed 4,800 pounds and Katahdin topped out at 5,000. They actually took them by train to New York City and then walked them off the train and down the streets of New York City to Madison Square Garden in 1906, where they were put on a display and people would pay money to come see these largest oxen on the face of the earth. Katahdin died at the age of 11. Rand actually had him stuffed and mounted, and that's what you see in the second photograph there on the right, and then would take him to parades and events. Unfortunately, in 1934, that was destroyed in a fire when the barn where the truck was parked kind of burned down. But that's one of Stetson's biggest claim to fame, was being home to the world's largest oxen. Back when he was running for president, Teddy Roosevelt, this image was put out of him swimming across a lake astride a bull moose. Roosevelt, of course, was no stranger to Maine. He visited numerous times as a boy and as an adult. He went to major towns, but he also toured Moosehead Lake. He climbed Mount Katahdin even after losing one of his shoes in a stream crossing. And he also visited with friends at Schooner Head and Bar Harbor. He liked to spend time in Aroostook County in a little village called Island Falls, where he went on guided hunts with the two guides that are shown on left. Roosevelt's on the far left in the picture on the left, and the other was Bill Sewell and Wilmot Dow. He was also guided by Maine's first registered Maine guide, Fly Rod Crosby, who was the first female guide and the first registered Maine guide in the state of Maine. And as far as that swimming on the moose photo goes, that's an excellent example of early Photoshop. It was a total fabricated photo. They had a picture of a moose swimming in a lake and a picture of Roosevelt astride a horse. And while he was running under the banner of the Bull Moose Party, they decided to put those images together. And they ran it in the papers back in New York and other places of the day with no mention at all that it was entirely a fake. Hikers on the Northridge Trail in Cadillac often wondered about a cross that can be seen chiseled into the pink granite bedrock. And for years, people believed it was left there by the crew of French explorer Samuel de Champlain, who quote unquote discovered Mount Desert Island in September of 1604. He's the one that named it Ile des Monts Deserts, literally island of barren mountains. But the stories really don't take into account the legend that it was done by his crew, that how many days would they have had to hike up there with their rudimentary tools, and how long would it take them to chisel that cross in the granite, and for what purpose? It doesn't have a name, it doesn't have anything else. Well, subsequent investigation in the 20th century showed there are actually 4 crosses and 4 iron pins nearby, and they correspond to the corners of a lot that was sold to the Hancock County Trustees of Public Reservations in 1908, which later became part of Acadia National Park, where they went on to donate it to the government. So it's really interesting to see how stories start and then how reality kind of creeps in. Like much of Puritan New England, Maine has plenty of fascination with the devil and hell and places supposedly beneath our feet. And some of it was a way to ward off interlopers or just to sort of reinforce some religious teachings of the day. So Maine has lots of different rock formations, chasms in the woods, places along the shore. One legend in the Milo area talks about the devil left snowshoe tracks in the rocks. Well, why the devil would be wearing snowshoes, I really don't know. But you can see Devil's Pulpit, an old postcard from York, the ovens in Bar Harbor, which were believed at one time, they were first called the portal to hell, but the people thought it would keep tourists away, so they changed it to the ovens. And then you have Hell Gate, which is an area of strong currents and rapidly changing tides and sharp rocks down near Booth Bays. And then the definitive postcard of the sign up near Cacajou, this is God's country, where I set it on fire and make it look like hell. I think one of my favorite stories is a place on old maps, it's not on current maps, in Sislodopsis Lake down in Washington County. And it's called Hell Before Breakfast Cove. And supposedly a man named Sam Hill swam out to retrieve a loose barge filled with hemlock bark that they were taking to a local tannery, and said, "I'll fetch that boat or go to hell before breakfast." Well, he disappeared before he got all the way out there and could never be found again. So they renamed that stretch of the lake Hell Before Breakfast Cove. And it'd be fun if some of those older names were still showing up on maps, I think. One of Maine's great claims to fame that's not always been widely reported is that it's the home of the donut hole. And it seems back in 1847, a 16-year-old cook steward named Hanson Gregory wasn't happy with the square or diamond-shaped cakes that they would fry up for donuts because they'd always be soggy in the center. And he supposedly came up with the idea to, he took a piece of tin and started cutting a hole in the center of the cake so it would cook evenly, and later had the tinsmith make him some cutters, and his wife and his mother began selling them back home in Rockport, where he was from. And supposedly legend holds, as he advanced to become a captain later in life, he did the donuts so that he could put them on the spindles on the ship's wheel and have a snack at the ready while he was on duty on deck. But he died in 1921, and the 1940 World's Fair had a special exhibit about donuts and had a portrait of him. And on the 100th anniversary of his discovery, a plaque commemorating his invention of the donut hole was placed on Old County Road in Rockport. It's right near a retail establishment there, and you can go and find it yourself. I think one of the quirkier things in Maine is what I call the infamous Hannibal Hamlin's death couch. And Hannibal was not always associated with some fava beans and a fine Chianti. He was actually Abraham Lincoln's first vice president, and he went on to be a U.S. ambassador and a U.S. senator. And he was born in 1809 while Maine was still part of Massachusetts. But he was at the Territeen Club in Bangor on July 4th in 1891, playing cards with some of his cohorts when he collapsed and fell unconscious. They put him on a couch to make him comfortable and said, despite ammonia and and a dose of brandy. He died a few hours later with his wife and son, who had come to the scene at his side. So the couch upon which they had placed him had been kept forever at the Territeen Club, and then later was donated to the Bangor Library. And if you go to the lobby of the Bangor Library, there's that couch with a sign on it that asks people to refrain from sitting on it, and considering what happened to the last person to do so, that's probably not a problem. Through my travels over the years, I heard of something called the Bumpus Barrel, and that didn't sound, was it a barrel? Was it a circus act? I didn't know, but come to find out, it was a large, extremely long crystal of barrel that was found in the Bumpus quarry near Bethel in 1928. It was considered the longest on Earth. It was 27 feet long and weighed 52,000 pounds. It tapered from 4 feet in one end down to just a few inches in diameter. It went on to be shipped in pieces to the American Museum of Natural History, Harvard University, and places like that. The last remaining piece, which weighs about 2 tons, was returned to Maine in 2017 and placed on display at the Maine Mineral and Gem Museum in Bethel, where they have a moon rock and lots of other great artifacts and natural wonders. It's certainly worth a visit. You know, Bangor is often in the news for a variety of different subjects, but in September of 1937, Maine public enemy #1 at the time, Alfred James Brady and his gang, arrived in town. They had already committed 4 murders and 200 robberies. And they went into a local sporting goods store, Dakin's, and purchased a pair of .45 caliber automatic handguns, paying in cash. The clerk was a little suspicious, and because they also returned a few days later and wanted to purchase a Thompson submachine gun, he said he'd look into it. Well, when they came back to find out what the clerk had discovered, the FBI and the state police were waiting, and a shootout broke out with more than a dozen FBI agents and even some Indiana state troopers. Brady and Schaefer came out of their stolen car, guns blazing, and ended up dead in the street, riddled with more than 60 bullets. And today there's a little granite block in the sidewalk that sort of commemorates that whole event. Brady was buried without fanfare in Mount Hope Cemetery in Bangor. People still visit his grave today. No family claimed him after that particular incident. If you go as far north in Maine as you can, the actual tippity top of Maine is one of the 4 corners of the country, and it's in Madawaska. And so some motorcycle enthusiasts up there have created what they call the 4 Corners Park, to have a place for people to come to when they're out riding the 4 corners. The other spots are Blaine, Washington, San Ysidro, California, and Key West in Florida. And there's also a little granite monument there and a fountain, which is dedicated to those windburnt and saddle sore participants. So if you have gone to all 4 corners of the United States on a motorcycle, you can go in and get a card. And Mr. LaChance, who created this park, who just happens to be the local motorcycle dealer, has created a titanium tour in Maine with stops in Madawaska, Grafton Notch, Kittery, and Lubec. And if you do that 4 times, there's no limit, you can check in with him and you are automatically a member of what's called the Titanium Butt Club, and you get a special shirt and pin to show off to your motorcycle friends. John Jacob Curtis was credited with being the first formal manufacturer of chewing gum on a large scale in a factory at 4th Street, which is now Hub Furniture in Portland, in 1866. His concoction involved adding wax and sugar to spruce gum, which is kind of a sticky, definitely acquired taste substance from the bark of spruce trees that had been enjoyed by woodsmen and Native Americans for centuries. Other flavors were eventually added, but the chewing gum industry in the United States really got its start in Portland, Maine. Maine's other acquired taste for a lot of folks, of course, is the soda Moxie. In 1876, a druggist from Lowell, Massachusetts, who was a native of Union, Maine, created what he first named Moxie nerve food. The formula initially, much like rumors about that at Coca-Cola a decade later, was super secret, but reportedly contained some gentian root. Moxie has won over a legion of fans over the years. President Calvin Coolidge, author E.B. White, and even Ted Williams' splendid Splinter was named the official soft drink of Maine in 2005. Since 1982, Lisbon's had an annual Moxie Festival with fireworks and a parade. And on the left image in this particular slide, you can see the Moxie Bottle House, which was created by members of the New England Moxie Congress, and it's now on display at the Matthews Museum of Maine Heritage in Union, Maine, along with a lot of other Moxie memorabilia. Of course, Moxie the soda is not to be confused with Moxie Falls, which is one of the highest in New England and is considered the highest, certainly in Maine, near Moxie Gore in the Forks. It plunges about 90 feet and there's no connection to the soft drink, although some might argue the dark kind of tannin-stained water that flows from in Moxie Stream is reminiscent of that. And the Abenaki word that Moxie stems from is actually means dark water. People can go there. There's a nice little overlook. You have to be pretty careful. It can get slippery. Every couple of years, somebody falls. And fortunately, everyone who has so far has survived. One particular calamity where folks didn't survive was the Territeen incident on the railroad, the Canadian Pacific Railway up near Jackman, Maine. And in 1888, they were rushing to complete the railroad across Maine, which would rushing to also complete the railroad across Canada from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And about a mile west of the former village of Territeen, which is kind of between Rockwood and Jackman, some Italian quarrymen who were working on the railroad line, dynamite went off prematurely and killed this crew. There were, some say 6 died, others say 13. It isn't entirely clear because no one wrote newspaper accounts at the time because these were considered immigrants. They were considered expendable workers. So no one really kind of cared, but someone erected a monument at the spot, supposedly where the men were buried, so that the work on the railroad could continue. And it's about a mile down the track from what's now called the Territeen Crossing. The letters RAM remain a mystery. There's some question about whether they may refer to Royal Arch Masons because of the way the A is formed, like Masonic square and compasses. It's still, there are folks that are still kind of looking into this, but it says Son of Italy and RAM 1888. And it's one of the many forlorn graves you may discover in Maine when you're out in the woods for river drivers or other folks like that. Lombard's loader, I think, is one of the coolest devices that was ever invented in Maine. It really is a snowmobile on steroids. And it wasn't until 1901 that a Waterville blacksmith decided to build a tracked vehicle using a boiler system similar to what there'd be for a locomotive. It had tracks on the back and some skis on the front with a little box because the person on the front they had to steer that because they couldn't see from the back. It had a top speed of about 5 miles per hour, but it could move 300 tons of wood at one time. It took 3 people to operate, an engineer, a fireman, and then that poor soul up in the cab. The record length for a train with one lombard pulling cars, which were really sleds, they didn't have wheels, behind it was more than 1/4 mile. And there are several lombards in museums around Maine. The Patton's Lumbermen's Museum has one that's an inoperative, but at the Forest and Logging Museum in Bradley, Maine, they have 2 working lombards, and once a year they bring them out and drive them around, and it's a pretty cool thing to see. There's a single cemetery in Rockport that I like to say epitomizes the best and the worst of childcare in Maine. And one of the saddest events in Maine history was the discovery of a 5-month-old baby boy floating in the bottom of a quarry in Rockport in 1940. It was in April. They determined the baby was already dead when it was put in the water, but no cause of death could be determined. Birth records were checked and $500 reward, which was almost $10,000 today, was offered. No leads were found, and no one ever claimed the body. People in the community donated money to give him a proper burial in the Seaview Cemetery, and a simple stone marker was put on that spot. And caretakers to this day frequently find toys and coins and stuffed animals and other mementos that people that are just touched by that unwanted baby story leave at the site. At the opposite end of the cemetery lies a grave of one of the most foremost childcare experts, pediatrician Benjamin Spock. In 1946, he wrote Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care, which became really the source during the 50s, 60s, and 70s and beyond. More than 50 million copies of that book have been sold. He had a house in Camden and loved to come up there and sail in his boat Turtle. And when he died in 1988, he asked to be buried in Maine because he said this is where his heart really was. One of the interesting things is that Burton Eye, which is considered some of the quintessential Maine humor, has actually ties to Admiral Byrd and the exploration of the Arctic. And along with Peary, Admiral Peary, who Eagle Island down in Falmouth end of the state, Maine was also home to Admiral Richard Byrd, who savored time at his 12,000 square foot lodge called Wickiup on the shores of Tunk Lake in Hancock County. It's where he planned his 3 different expeditions to the Arctic. In May of 1926, he and co-pilot Floyd Bennett became the first to fly over the North Pole, and in 1929, he was reportedly the first to fly over the South Pole. Wickiup's has ties to the late Robert Bryan, who partnered with Marshall Dodge to produce the series of Burton Eye recordings. The lodge was built by Bryan's grandfather, and the family continued to own an adjacent camp for years. Unfortunately, Wickiup, which was on the National Register of Historic Places, was destroyed in a fire that was set by an arsonist in 1984. I always say when it comes to one-upmanship in the management of number 2, there's no place like the village of Bryant Pond. In the mid-1800s, before indoor plumbing and outhouses were what people used, the Masonic Lodge had a back house built onto the back of the building that was 3 stories tall, and it remained in use until 2000. So it was a 3-floor outhouse. Lightning hit the building in 2006, but the privy remained unscathed. Next door at the Grange Hall, they don't want to be totally outdone, but they actually have a 2-story outhouse. And just down the street is a former municipal garage where Fox News personality Tucker Carlson just purchased to turn into a recording studio. I guess the record for the biggest outhouse in Maine was one that had 8 holes, which was in the early 1900s in a logging camp in the Allagash region. Bryant Pond in Woodstock is also the last place in the country to give up its hand-cranked telephones, and there's a monument to that. In 1983, they had 431 crank callers still on the line, and they were turned over to regular dialing, which was fiercely protested by a group called Don't Yank the Crank. So now there's a 14-foot high metal statue of a candlestick phone that's in Remembrance Park. And just a few yards away is the giant clothespin sign, which is billed as the largest clothespin sign of its type in the world, which advertises a mill that's no longer there. Over in Blue Hill, I like to talk about the Hostess Twinkies and the snack cake that would not die. People have often joked about it because it never spoils that it'd be great for survivalists. And in 1976, the students decided to test the theory that how long will a Twinkie last after it comes out of the package. And the company states that its shelf life is about 25 days in the package. But teacher Roger Benatti, they decided to put it in this little glass case, and it's remained there to this day. It's been on display now for more than 44 years. It's actually outlasted the company Interstate Bakeries that created it, and it now sits in the office of the assistant head of the school, Libby Rosemeyer, who was a student in that original class back in 1976. They report it's getting a little stiff and crumbs are falling off of it, but it's still not hard like a rock or anything like that. Back up in Aroostook County, one man's pride in trying to catalog the history of the logging era and how it's been done over the many years has resulted in the creation of the Chainsaw Museum. Chainsaw wasn't adopted really until the 1920s, but Louis Pelletier, a picture of him on the right here with Bill Green, who's a television personality and resident down your way. He is now cared for and restored and displays more than 400 chainsaws. And he says it also helps preserve the stories of the people that use them. He has left-hand saws, different configurations, some that had to be used by two people, some that were on wheels. And one of Louis' other claim to fame is right down the road, his sister, Kathy Pelletier, the award-winning writer, lives and continues to add to Maine's literature even today. The not so grand design, it's interesting that for years there was a monument at Ship's Harbor on Mount Desert Island in Acadia National Park that talked about the ship, the Grand Design, and how it ran aground right off Ship Harbor. Several columnists tried to get overland and go for help, and they disappeared, and they never returned. Well, come to find out, there never was a ship called the Grand Design. The Grand Design was the name of an expedition that was supposedly heading to south of the Virginia area, I guess, and actually went aground on Grand Manan up near Canada in 1853. And people conflated the two stories. The history was written wrong, so a tablet was put up at Ship Harbor here in what's now Acadia National Park in the 1900s. But once the true story was discovered, they actually removed the plaque. It's just like there was a plaque for years in Freeport at the tavern saying that's where Maine was made a state, when in fact Freeport voted against statehood in 1820, and there never was anything that happened at the tavern remotely associated with the creation of the state. For some lucky beachgoers in Old Orchard Beach in 1927, were undoubtedly surprised to see the spirit of St. Louis and lucky Lindy drop out of the sky. And he was doing a promotional tour after he'd gotten back from Europe and was due into Portland, and Portland was fogged in. Well, come to find out, the beach in Old Orchard is officially the runway. And he was able to land, and they packed him into a car and got him up to Portland so he could continue his talk. And he was able to keep his plane in a hangar owned by a gentleman named Harry Jones, who was the first airmail pilot in Maine. Maine has some other ties to Limburg, including the packing crate that the Spirit of St. Louis came back from France after that history-making flight was turned into a museum in Canaan. It's now no longer open to the public, but it's still a piece of Limburg history. And Anne Moore Limburg, who Limburg married, of course, spent many summers on North Haven Island, and she was the first woman ever licensed to fly gliders and to be a successful author and set many, many flight records. So Limburg and his amazing feat have plenty of connections to Maine. I think we're still a few months away from cold ears, but Chester Greenwood from the Farmington area is credited with creating the first set of earmuffs in 1873. He patented the idea at the age of 19 after asking his grandmother to sew some tufts of beaver fur onto a wire loop to keep his ears warm while he skated. He founded a company that went on to make them for more than 60 years. And in 1936 alone, they shipped more than 400,000 pairs. He started a bicycle business, set up the town's first telephone network, and had patents for heating system technology as well. Maine celebrated its first Chester Greenwood Day in 1977, and the first Saturday in December in Farmington. They still do that to this day. I think one of the late 19th century's most prolific inventors, Sir Hiram Maxim, who was a native of Sangerville, a small village up near Dover Foxcroft. He applied his genius to everything from automatic fire sprinklers to amusement rides and flying machines, and claimed to have invented the incandescent light bulb only to have it stolen by Thomas Edison. Primarily, he's remembered as the inventor of the 500 shot per minute machine gun, which he came up with in 1884. Anyway, while testing his designs in his gardens, in England, he reportedly ran announcements in local papers for neighbors to keep their windows open to avoid broken glass. No surprise, he later went on to suffer from deafness, which may have been from being around all that constant gunfire. He was bestowed with a knighthood by Queen Victoria in 1900. But Sangerville is also laying claim to fame for being the home of two people who have been knighted, the other one being Sir Harry Oakes. And he was born in Sangerville in 1874 and left Maine at the age of 16 to travel the world in search of gold. And he was shipwrecked on the Alaskan coast and held prisoner by Russians, but eventually struck it rich in Ontario, making as much as $60,000 a day in 1911. And he was knighted by King George VI in 1939. Oakes had a mansion in Bar Harbor, which today is part of the Atlantic Oceanside Hotel. He was tragically found bludgeoned to death at his estate in the Bahamas in 1943, and no one was ever charged with that crime. I think another great story that kind of shows Maine perseverance and Maine spirit involves Dwight D Eisenhower, president. And I always like to say Rangeley really liked Ike. Herbert Hoover's come to Maine, Obama's come to Maine, all different presidents have come to Maine, Teddy Roosevelt. But Eisenhower made the biggest splash when he came and went up to the Rangeley area in 1955. He was accompanied by a whole retinue of reporters and Secret Service agents, and they said he fished that first day and didn't get a single nibble, which certainly injured his pride with that much attention being paid. That evening, his guide, Don Cameron, got on the phone and asked his buddies all around in Moose Lick, Paguntic Lake, and Rangeley Lake to catch as many big fish as they could and to take them up to this pool on the McGalloway River and put them there because he was going to take the president there the next day. So they salted the Little Boy Falls pool and they put a little net just under the surface downstream so the fish couldn't escape. And at breakfast the next day, Cameron said to the president in a very, very casual way, "Let's try that pool again." And Eisenhower went there and he caught a 23-inch salmon right in front of all the news cameras, which made him very, very happy. And he was grinning from ear to ear. In 1970, the Maine Federation of Republican Women placed a plaque at the rocks, and that's now known at that pool called the Eisenhower Salmon Pool. Eisenhower was actually an accomplished painter, and this picture in the middle is of Don Cameron, which was painted by Eisenhower and given to him later as a gift. And you can see that painting today at the Outdoor Heritage Museum in Aquasic. Another claim to fame of the Rangeley area is that it was home to Wilhelm Reich, who was a doctor and psychoanalyst who was sought to educate the world about the mysterious properties of orgone, a biological energy he claimed was related to sexuality and health. He was considered by many to be a typical mad scientist, although he coined the term sexual revolution and built his house, a stone castle called Oregon, on a hill just outside Rangeley in 1948. He also experimented with accumulators, devices that could collect this orgone energy, which were large enough for someone to sit inside, and he claimed they could help cure cancer, and mobile versions could also cause it to rain. He was a colleague at Sigmund Freud. He did a joint experiment once with Albert Einstein, but still he was determined to be a quack, and eventually the Food and Drug Administration banned the sale of his devices and literature, and they were actually, much of it was burned in New York City. He went to prison in 1956 for violating the ban on continuing to produce this information and died in prison of a heart attack just before his release. Well, you can still tour the house to this day, and there's a lot of very strange things there if you want to go and see a side of Maine you don't think you'd ever see. And he also summered occasionally over near Hancock Point up near Bar Harbor here, but it's definitely a different side of the state. Maine, of course, with a large area of woods and waters and fog and pretty dark nights has plenty of mythical creatures that are out there. And in the book, we talk about the Turner Beast and the Cherryfield Goat Man for a couple. There's the Medibem's Howler and the Phippsburg Screecher, and Casco Bay has its Cassie, which is akin to the Loch Ness Monster. So they may not be as famous as some of the other mythical beasts, such as Bigfoot, but there's no shortage of those in Maine. I think one of my favorite parts of Maine, one of the more interesting things to see is in Aroostook County along Route 1 is the solar system model. It's nearly 40 miles long. It's in true scale. And when you drive it from one end, say you start in Holton and you go up to the University of Maine at Presque Isle where the sun is located, you're actually driving at about light speed. You're going the speed of light through the solar system. So there's all the different planets. The picture here shows them putting the Jupiter one up. It was a brainchild of University of Maine Presque Isle professor Kevin McCartney. It took years to construct with volunteers. Over the years, it's been lengthened, include the Oort cloud and asteroid belts, and it goes on into Canada and down into Washington County as well. There's a handy map there. Now in Presque Isle, they also have a Planet Head Day where people shave their heads and paint them to look like planets, all to raise money to help fight cancer. So if you get a chance and you're going up to Aroostook County, it's definitely something to stop and take your picture with the planet Jupiter or any of the other ones. In Portland, there's probably the quirkiest museum in Maine, and it's called the International Cryptozoology Museum of Beasts that may and or may not exist. And it was a brainchild of a gentleman who was a big proponent of that. And Lauren Coleman opened it in 2003. It's on Thompson's Point, and it's conveniently located right next to a popular brew pub. But there's the Jersey Devil, there's a life-size 8-foot tall statue of Bigfoot, and many other type creatures. So if you want to go see what may be going bump in the night, it's a great place to go. So that pretty much wraps up the presentation here. I've just shared a few dozen items from the book, which I say has 300 different items and places you can go and explore and facts about Maine. And they're available at independent booksellers, online, at your library. And thank you folks for joining me tonight. And I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. Let me stop the sharing here and then we'll kind of go from there. Great.
Thank you so much, Earl.
Oh, you're welcome.
That might be the most comprehensive overview of weird Maine or unusual Maine information I've ever listened to or read. So folks, if you have questions, just a reminder, you can type them in the chat box, the Q&A box, or you can press raise hand. But I'll get it started because librarians always have questions. So right off the top, I'm very curious, how did you compile all of this information? How did you gather all of this information?
Well, it's kind of funny. I always say when I'm working on a book project, I get really excited about the next book project. And you start taking notes and keeping files. And just my travels as a, working on my Moose River book, or, when I just exploring in different parts of Maine as a guide and what have you, I would come across a cross or a monument out in the middle of nowhere. And on the St. Croix River, there's the Unknown Baby Grave, or up on Baxter State Park, the Unknown River Driver. Actually, there's about 6 different Unknown River Driver graves in Maine, and there actually was a pretty dangerous occupation. So I just kind of made mental notes of that, and then I just started jotting it all down, and then start wondering, well, are there different pictures of this stuff? And little by little, I collect old postcards, and I've done some books based on histories of areas based postcards, and some of the postcards would talk about those kind of Devil's Den and different places. So that's kind of how it all got started.
I love that. And you know, given your storied career as a writer and a journalist, it makes perfect sense that you've had plenty of time to collect these stories. I'm also curious, are there any standouts to you? Do you have any favorite stories, or any of these more special to you than the others?
Well, I think when we talk about the capitals of Maine, I think it tells you about community pride, that there were so many places, everyone wanted their own little claim to fame. So if you were the best at something, and I think that, you know, some towns, honestly, they couldn't think of anything right off the cuff. So, you know, some towns became the crossroads of an area, or the gateway to another area. And I just think that there was, when I talk about Down East Maine as the capital of Maine, we had a fellow here for years, Gary Davis, who was president of the world. He wanted to start his own world government, and so he started it. We had Ted Wells, who was president of a country he called Oceanus, which was a country of all the oceans. They lived about 12 miles apart. And then there was a fellow that came here for a while, Timothy Tauver, who was the prophet of God. He said, you know, he was the one that could communicate with God. So, you know, after a while, you just go, okay, everybody's got a thing.
Everybody's got a thing in Maine, yeah.
Everybody's got a thing in Maine, and the Oceanus actually created its own currency, which got him in trouble with the federal government. But
oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, so it was just, and I just say, what is the spirit that drives people to kind of be like that, and to want that claim to fame for their town, whether it's the clothespin capital or toothpick capital or granite capital. In Belfast, of course, when they had chicken plants, it was horrible pollution in the harbor, but they were the chicken capital of Maine. They were happy about that.
I love that. So we did have a question come in from Scott. Scott says, wonderful,
Sure.
Thank you. Just ordered the book. And are there any stories you've learned about since the book came out that you wish you had included?
I can't say that there is, because we left 300 on the cutting room floor as it was. So that I think that we've added to that 300, but I don't think there were any that, I guess once in a while, I really tried hard to geographically balance it. You know, I think one of the things that was interesting, you find a lot of mistakes. I mentioned about the Codman Tavern in Freeport, and then the wreck of the Grand Design. There was the statue of a lobsterman on Bailey Island in Maine, and there were actually several copies of that made. There were 3 copies of it made. And years ago, one got placed in Washington, D.C. So there was one at the Maine State Library, one in Bailey's Island, and one in downtown Portland. And so all the news stories about Washington, D.C. said they moved it from Bailey's Island to Washington, D.C. And the thing is that I couldn't understand, why would they take the statue of the guy from Bailey's Island and take that down to Washington, D.C.? It didn't make sense. But the one is still there on Bailey's Island. So where did the one in Washington come from? And eventually I discovered that it came from the Maine State Library. It was because the one in Portland is still there. And it just goes to show you, there was an old maxim that one person in Maine writes all the news and they're grossly underpaid, and everybody else kind of takes their cue from them. Well, this was a case where back in 2008, somebody wrote an article and made that mistake that said the one from Bailey's Island had moved, and everybody just, and then it was in the stories about it being in Washington, and then everybody just copied that and kept perpetuating it, and it's wrong.
I love that there's one person writing the news in Maine, or responsible for the news in Maine.
And they're grossly underpaid.
And they're grossly underpaid.
But you'll see that stories progress from the weeklies to the dailies to the TV. You know, who does the original reporting? It's interesting.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I can think of a few potential examples of that myself. So I don't see that any other questions have trickled in. So I'll close us out with what I feel like is the most important question of the night, just personal preference. I've got to know, yay or nay to Moxie. Do you drink Moxie? Do you hate Moxie?
My father-in-law loved Moxie, and My grandmother in Connecticut used to drink it, and I have had a can or two in my life at one point thinking it wasn't too bad, but my taste has shifted since then. So right now I'm a native Moxie.
And I feel like everybody's in one camp or the other. So thank you so much, Earl. It was a delight. You were just such a wealth of knowledge. I can't thank you enough for joining us tonight. And we look forward to seeing what else you put out for books. I'm very excited about the naval ship book, so we'll keep our eyes peeled for that.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a great night, everybody.